Hello there. We have Ewa Krzaklewska joining us up next. Hello, Ewa. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do. Welcome.
Wonderful.
Good morning, everyone. That's great.
Yeah, it's almost good afternoon in Poland, at least. The topic of our conversation today is all you need to know about men in care, but we're afraid to ask. And you yourself, Ewa, are a sociologist, assistant professor at the Institute of Sociology, Jagiellonian University, but also a researcher in the Men in Care project. Scientifically, you're dealing with the subject of gender equality, mobility, and sociology of youth. Quite a field to study, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. But it's an exciting field, and
it must
a lot
be.
is changing.
And let's start with care. What do you mean by care? How do we define it in the context of our conversation?
In the context of our conversation, when we talk about men in care, we can define it I would define it very widely. When we think about men in care, we usually think about caring for children, about the father role. We talked about active fatherhood, engaged fathers, and the changing roles of fathers. But in our project, we are thinking about care in a wider sense. So we think about all different relationships that men have. So the relationship with the kids are, of course, very important, but so the relationship with their partners, with their wives, husbands, with non-formal partners. We think about relations with their parents, with their friends, but also with something a bit wider. So, for example, a community, neighborhood that men also have relations within. So when we think about care and relations, these are the diverse relations that are important in the man's life. Also, in our understanding of care, we included the aspect of self-care, which is also very important when we think about men, and particular men health, men well-being. That links a bit to the previous talk about mental health as well.
Well, it's a very direct link, isn't it?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is important that we think about different relations we have with different people, but also about ourselves and how we can be kind to ourselves. That's very important also in relation to men, because we know from the statistics that men's life expectancy is shorter, and they, for example, if they probably would call a psychologist even later than a woman, statistically speaking. So the understanding of care is wide, and also when we talk about care, I would point also to one more aspect. There is a differentiation we can make. We can talk about the care for. So we can talk about different practices that we do, that we enact, that we, for example, pick up our kids, we help them to we prepare them lunch. So we can talk about different things men do, but we are also thinking about caring about. So we are thinking about something deeper than just doing care, than just enacting certain activities, making things clean and being on time, but thinking about our responsibility, ourselves even, how care is important in our life. Is it our priority? How it shapes also who we are as men, but also as women, of course.
Tell me, Ewa, because it sounds to me what you're saying. I'm sure our audiences will find a lot of interesting comments, as much in your literal words as between the words of what you're saying, between the lines of what you're saying. But let me ask you this. Could you comment on the link between the notion of the equality of sexes and the involvement of men in care a little more?
Mm-hmm. There is a very strong link between involvement of men in care and gender equality. I could start from the concept of unfinished gender revolution, maybe. If we think about how the way we define the roles of women and men in society have been changing. And we have seen in the last maybe 50 years the change in women position in the society. We have seen the entrance of women into the labor market, getting professional profile, getting the careers. So we have seen a very strong, let's say, this first part of the gender revolutions when women enter into the labor market, and how their role ceased to be just a caring role or a mother role, but it became also a role of an employee. And a lot of scholars write to have like the complete gender revolutions. We need also the men not only to limit their sphere of activity to the professional life, but also open this sphere to care. And that's very important also for assuring the gender equality in relation first to women, because for example, in case of the parental leave, we assume that it is always a woman that takes maternity leave or parental leave after child. This will be always in the back of our heads when we employ her, when we recruit her, when we think about her advancement. But when we can also assume it in the case of men, that he could also go on the parental leave, then their situation and their evaluation as workers become more equal. And I think when we talk about men in care, we often say that this is very important that men takes care of kids on the same ground as women to assure this equality for women. But I think we have to also stress that not about the equality only for women. Mm-hmm.
Tell me, especially in Poland, talking about these things these days is more challenging than ever, I suppose, especially in the public domain, with so many peculiar voices coming from leading politicians. But tell me, one aspect to gender equality, as we look at it, is also linked to perceptions. And let's take an example. Once we see a man who is genuinely much more involved in family affairs, caring about the child, creating much more space for his partner to grow professionally, to follow a career. The perception risks there from the more conservative side of the society would probably be that the other men would be looking at this man as more or less a weakling type. Is that the risk or not? While, on the opposite end, women would be absolutely fascinated and appreciative of more empathy, more understanding, understanding that this fundamental equality should be there and there's no discussion.
I think you raised an important point. In fact, in Poland, women are having more progressive views, you would say. So in fact, women are more often pro-gender equality, and they would back up more like pro-gender equality solutions. But I would say that this will be like a streak of division, that the men would think it's weak and the women would think it's great. I think the attitudes of men are also changing, and there's a lot of men who wants to take the role of active father, of understanding partner, of a caring son, of a good friend, of a leader in the community. So I think the attitudes of men are also changing. Not all the men, of course, will say that. Of course, we are living in the world where gender stereotypes are still existent, and this traditional vision of family is still present. It is present also, as you mentioned, public space, in the public communication. It is mentioned in it is present in the children's book, and little books with little pictures, starting from when they are 1 year old, So
well, there is,
so it's true that
Eva, but there is no
denying.
There is no denying at the same time that the biggest aspects that the more conservative, let's call them in the flattering way, the conservative voices see the biology as explaining a large part of it, and they support their arguments saying that if this proportion of childcare, for instance, in a family, shift to the man looking after the child more than the woman who follows her professional ambitious career where there's much traveling involved also. And some of the voices you hear in this debate is that women become more men-like because that's what they need to become to be successful in a male-dominated environment. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, a very good question. Maybe instead of trying to push women into the male environment, we should try to think about how to reconstruct the environment so it is more welcoming on different roles, different activities, different ways of being men and different ways of being a woman worker or a man worker. So I think
Precisely.
that I'm totally towards this perspective, that we should try to reshape our way we are working and we are living with our families or in our relations. And I think the
Eva,
gender
you've said
stereotypes,
something.
so assuming women want relations and men don't want relations, are very damaging for that.
Exactly. But I suppose it's also fair to say that trying to introduce mechanical measures, even when you talk about gender equality, can be also hurtful and risky for the overall understanding of why broadening gender equality and creating a wise long-term platform for it, restructuring the entire work models around it even, that makes a lot of sense. But the promising thing you said, Eva, was that even in a systemically hostile environment to gender equality, I think it's almost fair to say that we are still there as a country. There are some promising trends because, as you said, the perceptions are changing. When you see a man looking after the child much more, spending more time with family, there is probably less and less, well, especially among educated people, I suppose, less stereotyping and labeling coming from other men. Like,
okay, I think
you have
raised
you cannot
many
make money
points.
for your
I want
family,
to,
your wife has to
if,
do
if
that.
I can, if I can comment about the mechanical solutions. I think this also relates to the mental health. I mean, why we allow solutions in some areas and why we don't allow solutions in other areas. Why we call in some areas the solutions mechanical and in other areas we call them effective. This is also, I think, very much based on our prejudice. If research
it's very easy. Wait a second.
If research shows that when men take care of kids and are more engaged, it has positive effects of psychological health of children, on women's careers, on well-being of women, on men's well-being, on different societal aspects. And we see the clear benefits for that. And we know that some solutions could work and are effective, for example, in other countries. Why should we call them mechanical? Why couldn't we call them effective? I understand the thinking about this very strong attachment to the kind of beliefs about who men and women are and how they should behave in society, and that they are so deeply ingrained that we can't do much about them. But if some stereotypes or positions lead to violence, why should we not find a solution for that? And the research shows, showed the research in Poland and in Norway, that in families where parents were co-deciding, where men didn't have a final say, there was less violence, there was less physical punishment, there was less threatening situations for kids. So we see that research shows that there are clear benefits from that.
Eva, on a personal note, in principle, I just couldn't agree more with you. But you do understand, I'm sure, that for the purpose of this conversation, I'm provoking you a little, taking you to the hunter-gatherer era, so that we can make this conversation.
I understand fully. They are good, many good provoking arguments. I try to beat them.
Let's push this conversation to a company reality. Why would companies now want men to be more engaged in childcare? I mean, a simple why question.
I think the companies, I mean, maybe it's too harsh to say that they want men to be engaged in care. I think the companies realize that they need to take into account that they have different workers, that as they are diverse, they have different realities they live in, and that these realities cannot be totally invisible, that they are impacting work, And pandemic has also showed that the caring obligations have impact on our work. And in order for our workers to be effective, to be successful, they need to be taken into account. So they cannot be just made unseen. They have to be brought into the picture.
Again, on a purely logical level, we definitely agree on that. But are we still dealing with a situation where a caring father actually wants to look after the child more, but still feels it's a bit of an embarrassing situation to go to the boss and say, hey, listen, I would very much like to go and look after the child more because my partner is having a career now and we think she's just making double as much money as I am. So why don't you just allow me to do that? So is it a sort of still a social stigma, or on even an individual level, even if a father, caretaker wants, is it an issue still?
I agree, it is not a norm that men go on parental leave. It is rather still an exception. Also in international corporations, who are even in those where it seems that the care is really an open issue, and you can talk about well-being, about work-life balance, but still there is this assumption, these very strong stereotypes that make men feel uncomfortable with that. And I think this is something we can change, and companies can change by showing the role models of other men who did it, to managers to do it and to talk about it.
I can already hear comments.
Up the things,
in my imagination, I can already see the comments to this type of perception. But tell me, does it require actually redefining also the very definition of success and happiness, especially for men, when you look at it less stereotypically?
Yeah, it does, and our research shows that men who went on parental leave, there was this change in their thinking about career, about different priorities. Do they want to just fully engage into just work, or they want to cut a bit more from their day to spend with their kids and also from their parents to build maybe a good family environment, or some even called like quality family life. So I think there is a very strong potential in engagement of men in care for changing thinking about it, and also for companies to discuss this and to discuss it with men who did it in the companies. So some companies do the panels and they discuss it with men.
With
who
only a
have
few
such
seconds left.
So to share it.
With only a few seconds left, what advice would you give to those men who want to raise this topic in their companies, but for various reasons feel they're not ready for that? What would be your advice?
I would search for I would try to see if there are other men who did it. Try to talk how it was for them. Search, maybe discuss with your colleagues if they are interested in such a thing. Maybe, but also check what are your legal entitlements. I mean, that you have a right to parental leave. This is something that if you have a child, you have 2 weeks of paternity leave, and you can share the leave with your partner. So this is your right as an employee. You can talk with your HR office, with your manager. I know it might be difficult, as particularly in some more masculine like environments and more maybe masculinized work placement when there's a lot of men. For example, on the construction sites, or in a very kind of masculine environment, it is harder to bring it up. But to look for others who did it, to feel like you're not alone, I think that would be maybe my first advice.
Ewa Krzaklewska, PhD, Institute of Sociology, Jagiellonian University. Again, Ewa, I couldn't agree more with you, and I wish that our guests at the conference will look more into the studies you're busy with on a daily basis, as I'm sure they're fascinating. And yet, at the same time, talking to you, I just can't get rid of the words of, for instance, the education minister talking about the traditional roles in Poland. So I suppose it continues to be a challenge, and in many ways we are still in the hunter-gatherer era. Thank you very much for your time, Ewa, and stay with us.
Okay, take care. Thank you very much. It was a great talk.